Welcome to a special edition of Off the Page, the show where we talk with Colorado authors to get the story behind the story. I'm Stacy McKenzie, a librarian here at Mamie Dowd Eisenhower Public Library in Broomfield. And today we offer an author talk by Boulder resident Margaret Coel. Coel will be discussing two of her books. Chief Left Hand is the nonfiction account of a 19th century Arapaho chief, also known as Chief Niwot. Blood Memory is a murder mystery set in present-day Denver. Both books give insight into how Native American history still influences our local and current cultures here in Denver, Colorado. The presentation also marks the 150th anniversary of the Sand Creek Massacre. And now, Margaret Coel discussing Chief Left Hand and Blood Memory.
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you to our 9th annual One Book, One Broomfield. Although this year we did it a little different. We have one author and two books. I'm Roberta Depp, Director of Library Services and Cultural Affairs for the City and County of Broomfield. And I'd also like to let you know that after the author's talk, we will have an opportunity to ask her some questions, and then following that in the lobby, signing books, and we have some books to purchase courtesy of Coyote Ridge Books here in Broomfield. The planning and the presentation of this community-wide program involves the contributions of many people and organizations. So I'd like to take just a few minutes to acknowledge some of those. The One Book Steering Committee is composed of the City of Broomfield Mayor Randy Ahrens, myself, Bob Jasinski, President of the Library Board, Colleen Sawyer, President of the Library Foundation and Library Board member. She has a fan club. Irene Roberts from the Broomfield Library Friends, Roseanne Dorn, former information officer for the City and County of Broomfield, Jason McKinney, a Broomfield resident and father of two lovely young children, Elaine Mason and Catherine Linnup from the library staff. Some of our community partners, the Broomfield Library Friends, the Broomfield Enterprise, the Broomfield Library Foundation, Coyote Ridge Books, the Arvada Center for the loan of the wonderful Edward Curtis photography exhibit that we are so pleased to be able to share with you, and the KCCB Channel 8 for taping this program. It'll be available on Channel 8, probably viewing in December, and we'll also have a DVD of it in the library for checkout. The Cultural Affairs Division and the Audie staff, Amy and her crew, who do a wonderful job here in the auditorium, and of course the City and County of Broomfield. We have some volunteer ushers tonight. We appreciate their help. And others on our library staff, especially Tiffany Clendenin, who helped us with some of the auxiliary programs that we offered and with the graphics for our material. So now I would like to introduce Mayor Randy Ahrens, who will introduce our author. Thank you.
Good evening. We'll try that again. Good evening.
Good evening.
All right, want to make sure you're up. You know, I remember when I was a kid and stuff like that, I had a teacher ask the class, she says, "What books have you been reading?" And one anxious student rose his hand and he said, "Black Beauty." And the teacher says, "Well, what's it about?" He goes, "Oh, about 120 pages. Margaret Coel is the New York Times best-selling author, best known for writing the acclaimed Wind River mystery series, set among the Arapaho on Wyoming's Wind River Reservation and featuring Jesuit priest Father John O'Malley and Arapaho attorney Vicki Holden. She also wrote two-book mystery series featuring Denver investigative reporter Catherine McLeod. The first one, Blood Memory, was one of the books on this year's One Book, One Broomfield. I really enjoyed reading that book because I recognized a lot of the places in the book. So that was really nice. The novels have received wide recognition. They have been on the bestseller list of numerous newspapers, including the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Denver Post, and the Rocky Mountain News. 5 novels have received the Colorado Book Award. She is a native Colorado who hails from a pioneer Colorado family. The West, the mountains, the plains, and vast spaces are in her bones, she says. She moved out of Colorado on 2 occasions, one to go to school at Marquette, and the other to go to Alaska, but she anxiously awaited to come back. Along with the Wind River Mystery Series, Margaret Coel is author of nonfiction books, including our other one book, One Broomfield book, and award-winning Chief Left Hand. The biography of an Arapaho chief and history of the Arapahoes in Colorado has never gone out of print. The Colorado Historical Society has included both Chief Left Hand and Margaret's memoir history of railroading in Colorado, Going Railroading. I need to get that book. Are among the best 100 books in Colorado. She writes in a small study in her home in Boulder. Holbrook Jackson once said, "Your library is your portrait." And I'm glad to say that part of my portrait is reading Chief Left Hand and A Blood Memory. They are great books, and it is an honor for me to bring up our author, Margaret Coel. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mayor Ahrens, for that very nice introduction. And thanks to all of you for coming out this evening and for reading my books. Thank you very much. If we didn't have readers, without readers, there would be no writers, that's for sure. And I want to thank Broomfield, the Broomfield Library, for selecting my two of my books, Chief Left Hand and Blood Memory, for their one book, One Broomfield program, and for making this wonderful evening possible. And for all of the other events that were planned in conjunction with the One Book program, the talks, the film, wonderful PBS film, which on Sand Creek, which I understand will be shown on Thanksgiving evening. The fabulous exhibit of the Edward S. Curtis prints. Roberta Depp, the library director, thanked so many people who make this possible, because anything like this, any program like this, just takes a lot of man and woman hours to put together. And there were a few people that I worked with in particular, and I do want to thank them, and that's Roberta herself, who I understand is really the heart and soul of the One Book, One Broomfield program. Catherine, yeah, for sure. Catherine Linnep, who pulled together about 1,001 details. Tiffany Clendenin, who brought in such a wide range and just such she really used her creativity and imagination to bring in such a wide range of programs to dovetail with my talk and with the One Book program. Let's see. Denise Muniz, who is in charge of the collection development at the library, who bought all the books and made sure they were here at the library so all of you could check them out and read them. The friends of the Broomfield Library, the foundation, the board, all of these people who helped to make the library itself work, and of course this One Book program work, and Coyote Ridge Books for hauling, oh, this is such a big job, packing up books in boxes and hauling them around and bringing them in and being willing to do that this evening so we would have books here for any of you who are interested in purchasing them later. Let's see, the Broomfield Auditorium staff and the film crew from Channel 8 and the sound crew. I hope I have everybody that at least that I, as I say, that I particularly was working for. But anyway, thanks to all of you. So this month, November, we are commemorating the 150th anniversary of the Sand Creek Massacre. This was the massacre of the Arapaho and the Cheyenne Indians, which took place in southern Colorado on November 29th, 1864. And both of the books, my books that were chosen for this program were chosen with that anniversary in mind. Chief Left Hand and Blood Memory, a history book and a novel, are both about the Sand Creek Massacre. Left Hand, the book that I wrote called Chief Left Hand, is about one of the great Plains Indian leaders, the Arapaho chief. He was there at Sand Creek. He devoted the last years of his life in an attempt to prevent what happened at Sand Creek, and he ended up giving his life there. The book is a history of the Arapaho people when they lived here on the plains of Colorado, and it's also a biography of this man. It was published in 1981, and much to my surprise and really delight, it has never gone out of print. It just keeps selling on, and people keep reading it everywhere. Left Hand's Arapaho name was Niwot. The town of Niwot was named for him. It's in Arapaho, however. Niwot is an Arapaho word, and it means left hand. However, it's not pronounced Niwot, as we pronounce it. It's pronounced something like Niwath. Now, I say something like because I maintain I'm learning to speak a little Arapaho. My Arapaho friends dispute that. I was speaking with an Arapaho friend not long ago. We were talking about Left Hand, and so I called him by his Arapaho name, and I pronounced it Niwath. And she got this startled look on her face. She really flinched, and then she burst into laughter, and she laughed and laughed and laughed, and she laughed so hard tears were running down her cheeks. And finally, when she composed herself, I said, "What did I say?" And she said, "Oh, you don't want to know what you said." So I've had 20 novels published, including Blood Memory. I'm just putting the finishing touches on the 21st. I've written 4 nonfiction books. 3 of them are about the Arapahoes, a collection of short stories, many magazine articles, essays, all kinds of things on the Arapahoes. But Chief Left Hand was the beginning. I spent more than 5 years researching and writing the book, and believe me, it was a labor of love. I had no idea at the time that I was working on this whether I could ever get it published. And if I did get it published, whether anybody would ever read it. And I just didn't care. Of course, I wanted people to read it, but I didn't really dwell too long on the possibility that maybe nobody would. I just kept working. I was obsessed by the subject. And so I kept working at it as if I had good sense, which I didn't. F. Scott Fitzgerald said, "Show me a hero, and I will write you a tragedy." And I saw a hero in Left Hand, and I wrote a tragedy. Now, how did all this begin? It really began in my own background. I'm a native Coloradan. I'm a 4th-generation Coloradan. I grew up in all the stories of old Colorado. I love them. I still love them. I became very interested in the people who were here before my family and everybody else came. And those people were the Arapahoes and Cheyennes on the plains of Colorado, and the Utes who were in the mountains. And of those 3 tribes, I read a lot about all 3 of them. And I became very interested in the Arapahoes. I wanted to know, how did they live? Where did they live? What were their lives like? And what became of them? This is what James Michener, in his novel Centennial, this is how he describes the Arapahoes. "And from the southwest came the poets of the prairies, less arrogant than the Cheyenne, less imposing than the Sioux. They were handsome men, grave of countenance and stately of mien. They were the philosophers and artists, the ones who listened when others spoke. But they were not to be trifled with, these Arapahoes, for they were men and women gifted with an inner dignity that had never been subdued. They called themselves our people, the Hinonoeno. And again, I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that correctly. As I say, my friends say, whenever I try to speak Arapaho, they say, well, we don't know what you're speaking, but it's not Arapaho. It's a very beautiful language, very beautiful, very melodious. From the movies, we have the idea that all the Plains Indians talked in ho, 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 like that, No, that's not the case. It's a beautiful, melodious language. The Arapahoes believe there are 3 things necessary for success in life or for happiness, and those 3 things are harmony, generosity, and respect. And if you live with these 3 things, and according to these 3 things, then you are living the Arapaho way. So they were very spiritual people, and they are today. But however, they were very practical people. And this really caught my interest in them. These very spiritual people who happened to be also very practical. They were, of course, hunters, and they were very, very good at that. They hunted the buffalo across the plains, and they used every part of the animal for shelter, clothing, food, tools, every single part. Nothing was ever wasted. The tiny bones were used for needles, the sinew for thread. And they were also traders. Located here on the Central Plains, they were the means through which goods were exchanged all across the plains among the tribes. So they were, in fact, the first people who came here, the first white people who came out here and got to know the Arapahoes called them the businessmen of the plains. So these 2 things, the fact that they were quite spiritual people and yet very, very practical people, businessmen, really caught my attention. The first treaty that was signed with the Plains Indians, in fact signed between the government and any Indian tribes, was the Treaty of Fort Laramie. It was signed in 1851. And in that treaty, the federal government acknowledged that the land between the 2 rivers, that is between the Platte River in the north, the Arkansas River in the south, and from the Continental Divide in the mountains to a point out in Kansas, that this vast land, the Arapahoes called it these beautiful prairie lands, that this land belonged to the Arapahoes and the Cheyennes. This treaty was ratified by Congress. Treaties are the highest form of law in our country, and that treaty stated this land legally belongs to the Cheyennes and the Arapahoes. So these people who lived here on this vast land, they had a number of leaders. But one man who really caught my attention, one of their chiefs, was a man named Left Hand. There are many places named for him. Niwot, of course, is one, but also Left Hand Canyon, Left Hand Creek, and other places that are named for him, that remember him. And what caught my attention about him was that he spoke English fluently. In fact, the journalist Horace Greeley came out here in 1859, and he interviewed Left Hand, and he wrote that he spoke English better than a lot of people in Boston. So he was good. He really was fluent. Now, I didn't know a whole lot at the time that I came across this little factoid. I didn't know a whole lot about the Plains Indians, but I knew this. They didn't speak English. Each tribe had its own language, and there was no need to learn the language of any other tribe because the common language on the plains was the sign language. That's how everybody communicated. And the white people who began to come out here on the plains, they learned the sign language. So everybody used the sign language. And here's this man who was fluent in English. And I asked myself, who was he? How did this come to be? What kind of a man was this? Now, this was the 1970s. I was a journalist. I was writing for magazines and newspapers at the time, and I decided I would write a magazine article on an Arapaho chief who spoke fluent English in the mid-1800s. I had no plans to write a book. I had young children at the time. It did not fit into my life, that's for sure. I remember a writing teacher that I'd had years ago say, something interests you, something grabs you, and then you pick up a string, and you never know where it will lead you. But you have to be willing to go wherever it leads, because it can take you on a great adventure. So I was interested in Left Hand. I picked up this little string, and I set out without knowing it, on what has really became a lifelong adventure with the Arapahoes. So I started out by reading all the history books I could get my hands on about the Plains Indians, about the Arapaho people, and about Boulder, and about Denver, and just the local history. And I found that left hand would be mentioned in these books. But it was always only a mention, and it was always the same fact in each book, or the same few facts. And I realized there wasn't a whole lot known about this man. There was very little known about him. And in fact, there was so little known, I didn't even have enough to write an article. So I kept looking, and I started digging. I started looking in the bibliographies of the history books I was reading, and I started reading the books listed in the bibliographies. And every book led me to another book, and then pretty soon I was in primary sources. And so, and by that I mean the letters, official reports, the records, the manuscripts, the journals, all kinds of things, all kinds of material from first-hand witnesses, people who were out here at the time, in the mid-1800s, people who knew Left Hand and who dealt with him. All of a sudden, that's what I was digging into. I worked in the archives all across a number of states: Colorado, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and the National Archives in Washington, D.C., the Federal Archives in Denver. I just kept going. I just kept going. And every source would lead me to something else. It was like a treasure hunt, and I was mining gold, and I hit a lot of hard rock, but every once in a while, I came up with a nugget of gold. And I remember sitting at Norland Library at CU one day. I was reading through old treaties. Now that's exciting. I'm wading through these old treaties. And by that point, I'd been working about 4 years. And I was researching writing. And I realized I have a 350-page magazine article. So I realized I had found a book. I hadn't gone looking for a book. In fact, what I really thought was, a book has found me. Later on, I learned what the Arapahoes believe about stories. And this is what they say. There are only so many stories in the universe. And from time to time, they allow themselves to be told. And when they allow themselves to be told, they choose the storyteller. So once I read that, I thought, oh, I get it now. Okay, that's what happened. So let's flash back to the 1970s while I'm doing all this research. We had card catalogs then in libraries. Anybody remember that? Listed subject matter and author. Resource books that listed magazine articles that have been published recently, collections of papers, manuscripts, journals, and they were listed in the card catalogs, and stacks of government records, old newspapers in dusty piles in dusty library basements, yellow and brittle with age, and microfilm and microfiche. My eyes fell out reading through all that blurry type, and these were my sources. And these were what I read through, all of which is now digitized and available at the touch of your keyboard. So today, if anything you want, any topic you're interested in, all you have to do is Google it. But in working in the archives and going through all these old records and these documents as I did, looking for a specific topic, I found so much else. I found things I wouldn't have known to Google. I wouldn't have known to go looking for. So in looking back on it, I don't regret it at all. I think it was a great way to do research because it was the old-fashioned way, that's for sure, but it paid off in many, many wonderful ways. I also I started going to the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming, where the Arapahoes live today. There are also many Arapahoes who live in Oklahoma because after Sand Creek, the government divided both tribes, and sent some of the Arapahoes and some of the Cheyennes north, and sent the other half of the Arapahoes and Cheyennes to Oklahoma. And about 1890, those in Oklahoma sold their reservation back to the government, so they do not have a reservation down there now. But the Arapahoes who were placed on the Wind River Reservation with the Shoshones, incidentally, their traditional enemies, the federal government thought that was a good idea to put these two tribes together. So they And the Cheyennes are at Lame Deer, which is in Montana. But they still have their reservations. And so they're their homelands, although I have to tell you that the Arapahoes today still think of Colorado, the plains of Colorado. These are their homelands. This is home to them. So I started going to those places. I went to Oklahoma. I went to the Wind River Reservation. I began to get to know the people. I had the chance to meet and begin to talk with some of the elders. Some of these people that I talked with in the 1970s, they were in their 90s. So just think how far back they went. They had firsthand stories of what it was like in the old time, as they call it, when they lived free on the plains. And they talked about Sand Creek. They spoke of Sand Creek as if it had happened yesterday. And I had the feeling while I was talking to these wonderful old people that I was just really touching history. And of course, all the time I was doing this, people would say to me, "You're writing about what? Who? You're writing about an obscure Indian chief that nobody cares about? You're writing about Sand Creek? What's that?" And then they would say, "Well, you'll never get that published." I had so many people tell me that it just fired me up, you know. I began to think, well, you watch me. And I just kept going. So as I kept going, gradually, the narrative of Left Hand's life and times began to emerge. And here was the narrative. He was not a simple man. He was a complicated man with conflicts. He was a man of peace who was a war chief. A man thrust into a changing world, and yet a man of his own time and his culture. He was a Plains Indian, an Arapaho who spoke English fluently, who understood white men. He tried to make peace with white people, and yet he at the same time, he was leading his warriors out to hunt the buffalo, to protect their own hunting grounds from other tribes, to protect their villages, to raid horses. Horses were necessary for life. So all the time he was talking peace, he was out on raids because he was a war chief. Why did he speak English fluently? Because a white man by the name of John Poisal, who was a trader, who worked out at Bent's Fort down on the Arkansas River near La Junta, married Left Hand's sister, Mayham, her name was, which means snake woman, and he began living in the village with the Arapaho people. Left Hand was young at the time, and he took Left Hand under his wing, and he taught him to speak English. The head Arapaho chief at the time was Hosa, who was Little Raven. He did not speak English. So Left Hand became the interpreter and his closest confidant and his advisor. It was Left Hand who was interacting with the white authorities out here who came out here on the plains after the gold rush. And not only on behalf of the Arapahoes, but on behalf of the Cheyennes as well. The gold rush in 1858 in the fall brought 35,000 white men here. Women came later, so at first it was men. And the real gold rush, the following spring in 1859, brought 150,000 people here, men mostly. The Arapahoes and the Cheyennes together, on a good day, could muster about 6,000 or 7,000 people. They were inundated. They said all the white men in existence had come to the plains. They said there couldn't be any more. They're all here. They said it shocked their minds. So just imagine that. Left Hand was a practical man. He realized there was no way his people could drive these newcomers out of this land. So he devoted himself to trying to find a way that two cultures, the Indian culture that was here and the white culture that was moving in here, could live together on this vast land. He was comfortable with white people, having grown up with a white man. So he did all kinds of things to interact with the white people on the plains. He went to the Rocky Mountain News. After the Rocky Mountain News had printed a story that was derogatory of the Arapahoes, he did not read, But he had a lot of white friends he spoke with and talked with, and so obviously one of them must have mentioned to him this article that had appeared in the Rocky Mountain News. He went to the Rocky Mountain News, and he demanded a retraction from William Byers, who was the editor, and he explained to him what had actually happened. And the interesting thing about this is William Byers believed him, and William Byers printed his story and said, this is what happened. He took his word over the word of a white man who had given him a different story. He took some of his warriors and went to see a play at the Apollo Theater on Larimer Street. And after the play was over, he jumped up on the stage and he gave a speech. And basically what he said was, as you have come here looking for gold, take your gold and leave us our lands. Go home and leave us our lands. But they weren't going to do that. They weren't going home because they were finding gold and they intended to find more gold. He visited settlers in the area, especially around Boulder. He brought his band there to camp in the wintertime. He really liked the Boulder area. And he visited settlers around Niwot, what became Niwot, Haystack Mountain, and he would spend time with them, talking with them about ways in which these two cultures could work together and how he could work with the authorities in Denver. He met with those authorities, with Territorial Governor John Evans, and with John Shivington, Colonel John Shivington, who was in charge of the military district in Colorado. He worked for peace through negotiation by talking. He was one of the peace chiefs, as was Little Raven and the Cheyenne chiefs, Black Kettle and White Antelope. But the young warriors, they called them the talking chiefs, because while they were talking, things just kept getting worse and worse. The buffalo were being scattered and slaughtered, and of course they depended for their lives on the buffalo. And the people were being driven about, they were being killed, children were getting ill with so many diseases, they were hungry. It was a disaster. And so these young warriors wanted to take matters into their own hands. And they began to do that by attacking the settlers, by attacking the wagon trains coming across the plains, stealing horses and stealing the cattle. By 1863, the Indian lands that legally belonged to the Cheyennes and Arapahoes were in the hands of outsiders. Towns, ranches, wagon stations were being built all over the Indian lands. The buffalo was being destroyed and dispersed, and it was getting more and more difficult for the warriors to feed their people. And most of the time, when they were stealing cattle, it was to feed their people. However, the military then that was here would march their troops out. They would indiscriminately attack whatever village they came upon. They would kill the people and destroy the village, regardless of whether the warriors in that village had been responsible for what they called depredations. So at one point in 1864, the warriors had actually cut off the overland trail, and that was the trail along the Platte River. Now, this area out here, the settlers here, were totally dependent upon getting food and goods, clothing, everything from the east. So with the overland trail cut off, they were isolated. So it was a very, very tough situation. And while the peace chiefs are talking, trying to work something out, of course, they were trying to keep their own warriors in check. And they were redoubling their efforts to do that while they tried to bring about a peace treaty. Finally, in September of 1864, the peace chiefs were escorted to Denver by a very good man, by a man who really believed in them and believed in peace, and believed peace could be worked out here on the plains. He brought them to Denver to meet with Colonel Shivington, and especially to meet with Governor Evans to work out a peace agreement. Governor Evans refused to meet them after they'd come some 400 miles in wagons. He refused to meet with them. And Edward Wynkoop said, "I've given them my word you will meet with them." And he said, "We're not leaving Denver until you do." So he forced Evans to finally meet with them. They met at Camp Weld, and there they told the peace chiefs, go to and put yourselves under the protection of the military at Fort Lyons. Fort Lyons was down on the Arkansas River near Bent's Fort. And we will make a peace agreement with you. And so they did that. They went to Fort Lyon. The commanders there told them to go out and camp along Sand Creek, which is about 40 miles away, so that their warriors could go out and get game to feed the people. So they did that. And they thought that they were waiting for a peace agreement to be worked out. So as Chief Left Hand's story unfolded, I could see where it was heading, and it was heading into this horrific black tornado that was Sand Creek. And on November 29th of 1864, Colonel Shivington, after they had, and they say this is in the records, after we had the Indians corralled, they say, they marched down there. Colonel Shivington led the 3rd Colorado Regiment. They were called the 100 Daysers because they had been called up to fight Indians for 100 days. And they were also known as the Bloodless Third because they hadn't actually gotten around to fighting any Indians. They were civilians. They were mostly miners. Most of them listed their occupations as miners. They had no military training. They had no uniforms. They had no discipline. And they were led by an untrained officer, Colonel John Shivington, and he found himself, I'm sure much to his surprise, in command of the military district of Colorado for one reason, and that's because the regular troops and the regular officers had been called east to fight in the Civil War. So that left out here the untrained militia. And when Shivington got to Fort Lyon, he coerced, there were some regular troops still at Fort Lyon, and he coerced them into joining him to attack these Indians at Sand Creek. Even though their officers remonstrated with him and said, no, we can't do that, they are under our protection. And Shivington said he would shoot any man who refused to fight Indians. So about 600 to 700 men under Shivington marched overnight 40 miles to Sand Creek. Camped at Sand Creek, there were about 600 Cheyennes under Black Kettle and White Antelope, and 60 Arapahoes under Left Hand. The main group of Arapahoes under Little Raven, they were on their way to Sand Creek. They hadn't gotten there yet. They were still on their way. And most of the people there were women and children and old people because most of the warriors had gone out to find game to feed the people. So at dawn, Shivington opened the attack on a sleeping camp, and they surrounded the camp and they started shooting at anyone who moved, men, children, old people. And of course, these people had believed themselves under the protection of the military. They put up what defense they could. The attack went on for hours, and at the end, Shivington and his troops gathered up all the Indian belongings, the teepees, the clothing, the food supplies, and burned them. And the flames burned all during the night. In my book, I say there were about 160 Indians who died there, because at that time, when I was doing the research, that's what the Cheyennes had believed, the number that had been killed. But now, further research, historians believe now that there were about 200 Indians who were killed there. All of the Arapahoes were wiped out. All of the people under Left Hand, that included his whole family. There were only 2 or 3 survivors among the Arapahoes. There were many wounded among the Indians. And they were able to, some of them were able to escape onto the plains. It was a really bitter, cold night, and they eventually made their way to a large Sioux camp. There were 7 or 8 soldiers killed and a few wounded. So it was a rout. It was just a rout. Left Hand was there. However, historians, when I started researching this in the 1970s, historians had been arguing ever since 1864 about what happened to Left Hand at Sand Creek. And some of the historians said, well, he was killed there. But Shivington himself had said, and he knew Left Hand, he said his body was not on the site, was not found. Other historians said, oh, no, he survived. And he went on to Oklahoma, and he resumed leadership of his people down there. Well, the interesting thing is that there was, in the 1870s, a very great man, a chief, an Arapaho chief in Oklahoma by the name of Left Hand. And in many ways, he was similar to the Left Hand here in Colorado. So I ended up, taking a sidetrack and doing a lot of research on the Left Hand in Oklahoma. And I found out a number of things. One, he was much younger than the Left Hand here He did not speak English. And there were many other differences. So I was pretty much able to separate them out. However, I didn't know what had happened to Left Hand at Sand Creek, so I couldn't write the story. So at one point I called a historian who had written a lot about the Plains Indians, and in one of his books he had stated categorically that Left Hand was killed at Sand Creek. Or I'm sorry, that Left Hand survived Sand Creek. So I called him, got him on the phone, and I said, I understand you've said that he survived. Yes, he'd said to me, he survived. And I said, and he's the same man in Oklahoma, he said. I said, well, that's great. I was really glad to hear that. I wanted him to have survived. I didn't want him to have died there. So I was happy. I said, oh, that's great. I said, could you tell me, I said, I've been researching this for years now, and I can't find a definitive source as to what happened there. I said, could you tell me what your source is? And he said, this is a professor. He said, you may cite me. I said, no, actually, I can't cite you. So I didn't have an ending. Then I got an idea. And here was my idea. George Bent, who was the son of William Bent, he was a half-breed son of William Bent. He was part Cheyenne. And he had been at Sand Creek. He had known Left Hand all his life. He was also educated. He had his father had sent him to St. Louis for a time. He had gone to school. He could read and write English and speak it, of course. And George Bent had his biography written by a historian named George Hyde. And in writing this biography, George Bent had written voluminous letters to Hyde about his life. And then Hyde turned them into a book called The Life of George Bent. And I went through that book, with a magnifying glass, looking for anything that would tell me what had happened to Left Hand at Sand Creek. And there was nothing. And then it hit me, well, wait a minute. Sometimes authors put things in manuscripts that editors take out. So something can be in a manuscript that won't actually make it into the published book. So I started thinking, I got to find the manuscript. I'll find George Hyde's manuscript. I started looking for it, thinking maybe he donated it to a library. Well, indeed he did. He donated it to the Denver Public Library. So I took myself down to the Denver Public Library. I asked for this manuscript. They pulled it up out of the basements and brought it to me. And I started going through it. It was exactly the same, word for word, as the book. But, tucked among the pages of that manuscript were letters that George Bent had written to George Hyde. And in the letters, he states definitively, Chief Left Hand was killed at Sand Creek. And then he goes on to say, he says a number of things about it, and then he goes on to say he is no relation to the Chief Left Hand in Oklahoma. So once I had that, well, actually, I felt very sad. I felt, oh, good, I can finish my book, but at the same time, I really felt sad because it was like learning that a member of my family had died. I didn't want him to have been killed there, but I knew I could go on and I could finish my book. And then a lot of other things fit into place, other pieces of evidence that I'd gathered up until that point. William Bent, George's father, had said, and of course he knew Left Hand well, he said Left Hand was wounded at Sand Creek, but he got over to the Sioux where he died. So he died at the Sioux camp. Little Raven said later, it saddened our hearts to leave Colorado because so many of our people lie there. Left Hand lies there. So finding those letters is not the kind of thing that could have come from Googling, That really took some digging. So since then, there are other letters that have been discovered, written by not only George Bent, but other people who were at Sand Creek, who confirmed that he actually was shot down there. He was mortally wounded. He was managed with other wounded, and there were, including George Bent, other wounded people to escape onto the plains, and finally they were taken to this Sioux camp. One source says that when the attack started, he came running out, his hands up, his palms out. That's the Plains Indian sign of peace. and that's when he was shot down. So he did make it to the Sioux camp, where he died. Now, in doing this research, we visited, my family and I, all the places that are in the book. We spent our vacations out on the plains. We went to all the forts and the battlegrounds and the sites of the villages and the trading sites, all of these places. And we went out to the site of the Sioux camp. Now, it's out by Cheyenne Wells, in southeastern Colorado, near the Kansas border. It's on a private ranch. And of course, you can't just, go wandering around a ranch without permission. You might get shot. So we went to the ranch house and we talked to this crusty old rancher, and we said, we understand there was a large Sioux camp here in 1864, and we would like to go out and just see the site. And we said, we will not disturb anything, we will not touch anything, we certainly won't take anything. And he's like, uh-huh. And I said, we just want to be there. And he said, uh-huh. And he's looking at our car, and he said, you're from Boulder, he said. And you just want to be there. I said, well, he gave us permission. So out we went. And we drove as far as we could drive. And we got to a point where we had to walk. Now I had instructions. We knew where this camp was located. It was located at the confluence of two creeks, which are dry creeks today. But at the confluence of two creeks. And we know all this. George Bant gave very specific descriptions of where this camp was located. So we drove as far as we could. Then we had to walk. And we're walking across the plains. This is August. It's noon. It is hotter than blazes. And here we are walking across the plain towards the confluence of these two creeks. And we look around, and what is following us but an owl in the middle of the day? An owl. And he's just like, just leaping along right with us. Finally, we get to this confluence, and the bluff, it's a bluff. We find it's a bluff. It's between these two creeks, but it's a bluff. So we are walking up this little slope to get up to the bluff, and here comes the owl. He's right with us. And we get up there. Now, it's brown. It's brown everywhere. It's brown plains. And we get up there, and it was so incredible. It's a huge area, and it was a sea of wildflowers. Every color you can imagine. Here in the middle of the brown plains. This was the site of the Sioux camp. And this is where Left Hand died, and this is where he is buried. So, and we looked around, and the owl was gone. And I know that the Arapahoes believe that if the spirits want to visit you, if a spirit wants to visit you, it will come in the form of an owl. I have told this story to some of the elders on the reservation, and they don't say anything. They've never commented. They just go, oh. They just sort of nod. So I'm getting the high sign back here, so I've got to wind this up. But just briefly, I do want to mention blood memory. Blood memory is about Sand Creek. And a lot of the information that's in Left Hand is in Sand Creek. About Sand Creek is in Blood Memory. It's a novel, and one thing that you can do in a novel is probe the emotional depths more than you can by just listing or writing about the facts. Although I have to say, I think there's a lot of emotional depth in the facts of Chief Left Hand. But that was one thing I wanted to do. The character, Catherine McLeod, is an Arapaho, but she's been adopted out, raised in the white world in Denver. She doesn't really know her background. She doesn't know about Sand Creek. And so in the course of the book, she comes to learn about Sand Creek and what it means to her. That's really what the novel is about. It's about her coming to grips with her own past. I had people say to me after the book came out, oh my goodness, you must have done so much research to be able to write this book. They hadn't read Chief Left Hand. You would say, oh, you must have done so much research to write Blood Memory. How long did that take you? And I said, well, about 15 minutes, because I just pulled Chief Left Hand off the shelf, read through the parts on Sand Creek, and wrote the book. So I think we have some time for a few questions. If any of you have questions? Oh, well, on the reservation, there are about 11,000. However, when they went to the reservation in 1878, there were 800. Now, there were probably that many who went to Oklahoma. I mean, that's how. My friend tells me, my Arapaho friend, she says, this way she put it, she said, there were 800 of us, and she said, we were a pitiful lot. And they were. They had lost a war. Most of their warriors were dead. Their children were dying and ill with disease and, starvation, and they were a pitiful lot. Why couldn't the tribes get along? I think that is one of the biggest mysteries, I think they were used to contending against one another for hunting grounds, for the buffalo grazing areas. They were used to protecting themselves. And I tell you, the Arapahoes, though, were people who brought the other tribes together because they were traders. And they were actually instrumental in having bringing together peace agreements among all the Plains Indian tribes without any white people involved at all, in order to work out, who was going to hunt where, because hostilities and the tribes fighting one another, that was bad for their trading business. So they did try to keep the peace. They really were peacekeepers on the plains. I don't know. I often think if they could have worked together against their common enemy, they would have still lost the war. They would have lost, because they could not have driven the people off this land who had the guns. They couldn't do it. However, they would have been in a stronger position when they came to negotiating some kind of a peace. How do they like to be called? Do they like to be called Native Americans or Indians? What do they like to be called? I've been going to the reservation every year since, the 1970s. I have many friends up there. I have never heard one of them refer to themselves as Native Americans. They call themselves by their tribal name. We're Arapahoes, we're Cheyennes, we're whatever we are. They also call themselves Indian people. You hear that a lot, or just Indians. There is a Catholic mission there, which I write about. It's called St. Stephen's Mission. It was founded by the Jesuits. After the Arapahoes were placed on the reservation, they knew they were going to have to follow a different road. And so some of their leading men went to Omaha and asked the Jesuits to come and teach their children. And the Jesuits agreed to come. And they gave them the land, and they helped them build this mission. And they had a school there up until the 1960s, when they had to close it because of lack of funds and lack of manpower. But for all those years, they educated people up there. And they ran excellent school from kindergarten through 12th grade. Such a good school that the white people in Riverton and Lander were going onto the reservation to go to that school. So yes, there is a real mission. It's called St. Stephen's Mission. In my books, it's St. Francis Mission. The people in my novels are totally figments of my imagination. They are not based on anybody. There is a priest there called Father John O'Malley. I made him up. There's a Arapaho woman, a lawyer, called Vicki Holden. I made her up. But I'm told up there, my friends tell me, they're always trying to guess who these people really are. They all have different ideas. Okay, any other questions? The new book called Night of the White Buffalo, which Coyote Ridge is kind enough to bring some copies, it just came out. And it does deal with it's set on the reservation. All of my novels, because I love history, and because I wrote history before I started writing novels, all of my novels deal with some aspect of Arapaho history and a lot about the culture. And so in the Night of the White Buffalo, that deals with the birth of a white buffalo on the reservation. And the white buffalo is considered the most sacred of all creatures, you know, a sign from the Creator himself. And it brings turmoil whenever a white buffalo is born, because people come from everywhere to see the white buffalo. So that's what that story is about. What are the conditions on the Wind River Reservation? Yes to all your things. There's a lot of poverty. Now you have to remember that all reservations are in rural areas. There are 2 towns close to the reservation on the borders, Riverton and Lander. They're very, very small towns. There isn't a lot of employment in either town. You know, so where are these Indian people going to go to get jobs? So there's a huge problem with unemployment. They do have oil and gas on the reservation. However, the government didn't know that when it sent the Shoshones and the Arapahoes there, but they do, and they lease out the rights to their oil and gas, and they get royalties from the oil companies. So they have a little bit of money. Nobody's rich, believe me, but they have a little money coming in, which is helpful. They have a large Arapaho ranch where people work that provides quite a few jobs. And about 5 years ago, they built a casino. It took them 7 years of fighting with the state of Wyoming that said, no way, we will not have a casino in this state. Now, those of you who know Wyoming, they've been gambling in Wyoming since day one. You can play the slot machines at the Elks Club. You know, we're up there a lot, and we're reading the paper, oh, Saturday night, fun night, over at the community hall. Really? What's that? Fun night? So Wyoming said, you will not have a casino. And they would not make a compact with them. And it went all through the federal courts several times. And the Arapahoes kept winning. And then the state would come back, and they'd bring up another reason why they couldn't do it. This went on for 7 years. And finally, the state gave in, and they did build a casino there. And the casino and it's beautiful, and they have a hotel with it. And I want to tell you, it's beautiful. So if you ever go up in that area, if you're on your way to Yellowstone, you can stay there. It's on Highway 749, just south of Riverton. It's really nice. And it employs 500 Arapahoes. That is huge. That's huge. So they have that. They have a tribal college. They really work hard to provide education. They have good high schools. They work with their kids. They have an Arapaho immersion school where the kids can go to school and they learn in Arapaho because they're trying to preserve their culture. They do have problems, alcoholism, drug abuse. They have those problems. But they don't need outsiders to come in and tell them, gee, you got these problems. We're going to help you. They're working themselves on it. They have all kinds of programs to address these problems. Thank you. Thank you so much.